Shadow of the Erdtree is great, and it's great in a way that games often don't get to be great. Great in that kind of way when you procrastinate on a project and you finally do it and it's not that bad, but you know it could be a lot better if you had an extra go-around. It's that great thing you imagine yourself making if you had more time. And the sheer success of their first draft, Elden Ring, meant they had the time to make pretty much another feature-length game on top of it. And I think its biggest successes come from addressing the problems with the base game. I'm gonna keep this mostly spoiler-free, both for the sake of letting this function as a recommendation for those that haven't played Shadow of the Erdtree yet, and to make it semi-accessible for my subscribers who aren't Elden Ring players, but I am gonna briefly mention some bosses from the mid or late base game, so avoid accordingly if that bothers you. Pretty much since release, I've been as much of an Elden Ring hater as you can be while still loving the game. It's impressive how From Software was able to adapt their pretty distinctly Metroidvania franchise into an open world while still maintaining so much of the feel and identity. But I don't think that it's true that they avoided the drawbacks of open world games. The sheer amount of content needed to make some large world like this feel full meant reusing a lot of dungeon assets, layouts, and bosses. There are more or less 4 types of minor dungeons you can run into in the game, and they occupy roughly the same percent of the game world as you progress through it. The problem for me, and I gather a lot of other people, was that this became increasingly less rewarding as the game went on. The first time you find a tunnel, the first time you go to a hero's grave, the first time you go to a cave or a catacombs. These are all rewarding new experiences with different aesthetics and enemies. But as the game goes along, you've seen each of these types 5, 10, dozens of times, where for me, at a certain point, I would just leave if I found one of them. And I do understand that that's sort of the point. They are opportunities to get a little bit stronger in the game, maybe fight a boss that isn't going to be a roadblock. They gave a lot of players small wins, particularly early in the game, and they probably contributed to this being the game that got so many people into the Souls series. It's great for those players, and the solution for people like me that are annoyed by it is just to not play it. I find this explanation unsatisfying. While I don't have to do all of the dungeons I don't enjoy doing, every time I found one was an instance of my exploration being rewarded with disappointment. And the cumulative effect of how often these dungeons were repeated meant that at a certain point I was not just more likely to turn around when I found one, I was also less likely to even try and find things in the map at all. I played the game at release without a guide, and I never even found Jarberg. On a much more embarrassing note, I also only found 3 out of 12 sacred tears to upgrade my flasks. I don't entirely know how this happened because it was from a playthrough I started over 2 years ago. You find these in churches, and I'm guessing I just never saw the pattern because I didn't find enough of them, because the overworld is also full of a lot of the same assets, a lot of samey ruins, a lot of samey graveyards, and yes, a lot of samey churches. Actually, even more embarrassing, I never found the Flask of Wondrous Physic, a really big part of the game apparently. And before anyone makes fun of me for this, I beat most of the main game bosses and half the DLC with all that. I'm just that good at video games. Now, I could have figured some of that stuff out. I found it really rewarding when I realized that you can see these burnt looking dots on the map, and those are tunnels where you can get ore to upgrade your weapons. I think it would have been a really satisfying realization to do the same thing with churches and sacred tears. But I had started to apply to the overworld the lessons I had learned in the underworld. That repeated assets signal very optional strength building experiences that are going to be less rewarding than some of the game's legacy dungeons and major bosses. And this was true for me enough of the time that it disincentivized exploration, which is a real shame because that's a strength of the whole series and especially should be a strength of Elden Ring. And it's an even bigger shame because there are really cool things to find among that optional content. My Sacred Tear debacle is a bit of an extreme example. Most people were not as negatively conditioned by this as I was. But there are still enough times that there are meaningful items in these locations, parts of quests, cool NPCs, even an integral part of one of the game's endings, and even like really cool variations of catacombs that don't show up until the very end of the game when I had already given up on them. And while Elden Ring made this series click for a lot of people, I do also think that just the sheer size of it, the amount of hours that someone knows they need to put in experiencing this game, is its own obstacle that would be somewhat overcome by a slightly smaller game with less recycled content. Then there's the additional dramatic problem of repeated bosses. So much of my enjoyment of bosses in these games comes down more to vibes than mechanics. FromSoft bosses have this impact from feeling like you're fighting these really unique personalities and creatures that are defining parts of the lore and themes of the area they're found in. I think the amount of times that bosses are repeated in this game damages that feeling. Looking at just the achievement bosses, of these 30, 9 of these are the first iterations of a character or moveset that are going to be encountered again later in the game. 7 of them are either those second harder versions of the first 9 or a second version of a boss that doesn't have an achievement. Another 8 are either singles or multiples of bosses that occur again and again throughout the game. Then just 6 of these 30, 20%, are fights with a character that really only appears the once. This doesn't include a few unique fights in the endgame that just don't have achievements, but beyond that, everything is repeating bosses. And I do think some of the repetitions are very clever, make sense lore-wise, and have a good emotional and thematic impact. But that it's almost every boss leaves me less with the impression that I'm re-encountering a character in their true form, and far more conscious of the logistical reality that it is just really hard to make enough boss movesets and character designs that fill a game this big. Magma Worm Makar is one of the best examples of this. Encountering him for the first time at the end of a really long vertical dungeon gave the impression of fighting this legendary creature inside of this specific mountain, and as you go along it's just kind of like, nah, when there's lava sometimes these things are around. I am not saying that From Software is incompetent, lazy, or disrespectful towards their audience. I don't even think there was a conscious choice between having a smaller open world with less repeating content and having the game that we got. I'd imagine the general shape and size of the world came around first with the expectation that a lot of these areas would be more unique and have a little more effort put into them. But at a certain point you have to launch your game, and I don't think they were incorrect in deciding what they had was good enough. But it did mean that even though Elden Ring avoided some of the pitfalls of open world games by not overloading the map with icons or depending on a quest log to direct player goals, it did include a lot of repetitive and padding content that is sort of the reality of trying to make something this big. No other game in the series comes close to having the problem to that severity, even Dark Souls 2 by a pretty good margin. I tried the Demon Souls remake for the first time after Elden Ring and was relieved to play a more linear FromSoft game again. I also think it would be dishonest to leave out that part of that relief and part of these complaints in general is that I am just very tired of open world games across the board. I have felt a lot of relief in recent years playing the Souls series because it's less about expanding this sandbox of limitless possibilities and more about discovering how this tangle of paths reconnects and leads into each other. I feel a lot better when I'm exploring a maze than when I'm let loose in this big open field. A lot of my time in Elden Ring feels less like I'm exploring and more like I'm mowing the lawn. If I really wanted to thoroughly explore Liurnia of the Lakes, I would need to go back and forth with Torrent so many times. And again, in my annoyance with that, I missed a really cool NPC on my first playthrough. It feels arrogant to say all this, to complain this much about this technological marvel of a game, and admit I'm already predisposed to dislike open world games in the first place. I have the confidence to voice this because Shadow of the Erdtree addressed every single complaint I had. There is far more variety in dungeons, more fully unique bosses than the entirety of the main game, and they made large open world exploration so much more exciting. The DLC uses 3 types of smaller dungeons. 2 of them are completely unique to the DLC, and none of them occur more than 3 times. Even though catacombs are back, the ones that are here feel incredibly mechanically distinct from one another. A good bit of my highlights from the DLC came in these repeating dungeons, and this to me was the floor for content. The different biomes in the overworld, some of the smaller legacy dungeons like castles, and the full legacy dungeons that rival the main game were often much better. And this gave me the opposite conditioning of what I got in 2022. I wanted to see every corner of this game and find everything there was to find because I had learned over and over again that it was worth doing that. And this was helped by fixing that lawn mowing problem I was talking about, having less areas quite as big and flat as Liurnia or the beginning of Altus Plateau, and by having a lot of areas just wide enough to jump around on your horse and fight big enemies, but usually not so wide that riding down the middle you can't see all the points of interest on either side of you. There's also a lot of verticality in the DLC, so you're constantly seeing areas that you'll either die trying to fall down to or can't find a way to climb up to yet, and it's immensely satisfying when you finally figure out how to get there. They've recreated that web of interconnected paths thing I was talking about, but on a much larger scale. It's such a wonderful compromise between the exploration sensibilities of earlier games and the benefits of open world games. I was having so much fun with it early in my run that I decided to experiment and see just how much of the game world I could explore before running up against a boss that I had to beat. And I would say I was able to go roughly 80% of places without beating any bosses, with, say, maybe another 10% behind easy bosses, and a small bit locked inside the end game. I say this to both reinforce how fun the exploration was in this expansion, and to counter some of the complaints that surrounded this game around difficulty. Review bombs of Shadow of the Erdtree started really quickly after its release, and while I'm sure there are good critiques among them, it took me so long to just fill out the map that I knew people weren't upset that they had fully exhausted the things they could do based on their skill. There's no way they'd have done that a day after it came out. They were complaining that they were not immediately able to overcome every challenge in front of them from the get-go. My point is not to rag on those players. My point is to say that if you're someone that was discouraged by the initial conversations around difficulty of this DLC, you will find tons of things to fall in love with before running up against its biggest roadblocks, which you probably will be able to overcome as well. Over a playthrough, you gain a lot of power from Shadow Tree fragments and Revered Spirit Ashes, which increases how much damage can be given or received by the player or their summons, respectively. This can as much as double your power and make a lot of those encounters that sparked that initial backlash a lot more manageable. I've seen some complaints that in the world there exist exactly enough of these to get to full upgraded status, whereas something like Golden Seeds in the main game had more than enough to fully upgrade the charges in your flask. But I think this change is downstream from FromSoft being much more confident about every part of the game world here. These fragments and ashes are incentives to really see everything there is to see. If you don't have all of them, there's still more to explore, and now all of it is actually worth finding. They've recreated the concept of finding a roadblock and exploring elsewhere to get more powerful, but this time without filler. That's not to say that a fully upgraded character won't still have trouble with some of the bosses. I'm not someone who's played any of these games several times, so I don't often have really nuanced critiques of boss mechanics, but in broad strokes, in myself and what I've heard from others, it seems that Elden Ring has tried to provide a new level of challenge for players who like to solo every boss only using melee weapons, while at the same time making them very doable for people that use spirit summons. This pushed a lot of players like myself, who previously played the Dark Souls trilogy and Bloodborne this way, into a territory of immense frustration without using spirit ashes. I have made peace with this. I still soloed a lot of the bosses in the DLC, even some of the harder ones, but there were others where I wasn't having fun, so I just did what got me through it. I understand and empathize with people that really want to solo these bosses being very frustrated by the DLC, but if fear of difficulty has kept you away from the DLC thus far, I don't think that you're one of these people. If you're comfortable using summons, if you're comfortable using magic, if you're comfortable looking up broken builds, there are tools for every one of these bosses that will allow you to get past them. I will adamantly defend the lack of an easy mode in these games. There is nothing that allows you to just mash buttons and automatically beat any enemy, because the important part is you taking an active role in figuring out how to get over this challenge. You decide what that quest looks like. I find it very rewarding to Rocky-style train and learn the timings of a boss, but I also see the value in consulting the ancient scrolls of Fextra Life and journeying to different corners of the world to collect the talismans, armor, and weapons that haven't been patched yet so you can melt a boss's health bar. Most of the footage in this video is from my New Game Plus run where I fully embraced this philosophy. That is not to say that every boss is easily trivialized, but I believe each can be made doable even for players without amazing reaction times. Oh yeah, and there are better bosses, or at least just a bunch of them that don't repeat. I had such a sour taste in my mouth from all the bosses you fight in the same cavernous rooms. In Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses are so much the opposite. They're aesthetically beautiful and feel like they belong specifically in the arenas they're in. It's hard for me to imagine being more satisfied with the DLC. It made me excited about Elden Ring again, when I'd walked away from it kind of frustrated in 2022. I know a lot of people have already played it, but if you're one of those that hasn't, I highly recommend it. And if you're someone who has, I'd love to hear what you think, especially if you disagree with me. My critiques here are more than anything else a way to articulate the experience I had with the game, so I find it fascinating to hear when people take away something different.